The expression of Justin, who wasn't interested in the movie, instantly darkened after he saw what she had done. Instead of feeding her own daughter, she was feeding his son. If even something like this wasn't her attempt at trying to please him and pursue him, then how else was he supposed to interpret her actions? Upon sensing a cold aura coming from the side, Nora slowly opened her eyes and looked over. When confronted with Justin's deep and dark eyes, which also had a bit of a sharp look in them, she was taken aback for a moment. Was she dreaming? Otherwise, why was she seeing Justin in the movie theater? Her sleepiness disappeared instantly. She lowered her eyes lazily and wondered, is this a coincidence? Or is Justin here because he suspects that I'm anti and has come to sound me out? Things had gotten troublesome. She wanted to pretend that she didn't see him, but her instincts told her that the man seemed to still be staring at her at the moment. On top of that, he had a rather hostile look in his eyes. Nora turned to the side and gave a perfunctory greeting. What a coincidence, Mr. Hunt. A coincidence. The look on Justin's face turned darker. Never mind that we're watching the same movie, but even our seats just so happen to be next to each other's. What a coincidence. Indeed, Nora was puzzled. Why did he sound so sarcastic? She frowned. What do you mean by that, Mr. Hunt? Justin replied coldly. I told you, I hate it when people try to approach me by using my son. Did you forget what I said, Miss Smith? Nora was astonished. He was misunderstanding her again and again. Had he had enough yet? Nora slowly retracted her gaze and looked in front of her seriously. She said, you are indeed an attractive man, Mr. Hunt, but you shouldn't be too narcissistic, either. Men like you who look prettier than women aren't my type. Justin sneered. Your actions are so blatant, Miss Smith, yet you're still trying to hide your intentions? Let me make things clear, I'm not interested in you. If you have the time to seduce me, why don't you think about how to cure your aunt's illness instead? His words angered Nora. That man must be sick in the head, she said coldly. Don't worry, you needn't bother yourself with my aunt's illness at all. When he heard how she glossed over the topic, Justin became even angrier. He was about to retort when the moviegoer with their children seated in the row in front of them suddenly turned around and snapped. Hey, we're in the middle of a movie here. Can the two of you refrain from quarreling with your other halves in here? Justin was bewildered. Nora was bewildered. The movie theater was pitch dark. Justin didn't know why, but he didn't immediately feel any disgust when someone else misunderstood him and Nora as a married couple. Instead, a dazed feeling, not easily detectable, arose in him. The moviegoer added earnestly, can't the two of you, as husband and wife, control yourselves a little better in front of the children? You're scaring them. Nora looked at where the moviegoer was pointing and looked down to see Cherry, who was sitting there with a mask on and only her eyes exposed. Justin bent over and picked her up. He said with displeasure, this is the last time I'm warning you, Miss Smith. The next time I see you approaching my son, I'm not holding back. He strode away right after saying that. Nora was bewildered. She glanced at the other side, finding herself mystified when she saw Pete there. It seemed like her hand had gone the other side instead when she was feeding Cherry just now. Right. While she was hesitating, Pete held her hand silently and said, let's go too, Mommy. He hereby declared that the first date had failed. When they returned to the hotel, it was already 4 in the afternoon. Nora went to sleep again. The next day's operation would last 7 or 8 hours. If she didn't get enough sleep, she wouldn't have enough strength and energy to support her through it. Pete, who was next to her, anxiously sent a text message to Cherry. How's it going over there, Cherry? Meanwhile, on the top floor, Cherry was facing off with Justin. Justin ordered, you're forbidden from making contact with that woman in the future. Cherry's large eyes were full of grievances as she asked, why? Knowing that it wasn't right to speak badly about other people in front of children, Justin didn't answer right away. However, Lawrence, who was next to him, answered, it's because she's someone that just sits on the sidelines and watches without doing anything even though her aunt is sick. On top of that, she's even going to the movies. That woman is too cold-blooded. Cherry panicked and retorted angrily, Mommy isn't cold-blooded. She's someone that values relationships the most. She'll definitely save Grand Aunt. Justin's expression darkened. Never mind that she was cajoling his son to call her mommy, but he's even addressing her aunt as grandaunt now. You're a bad daddy. You can't say that about her. I'm ignoring you. Cherry pouted aggrievedly. With tears in her eyes, she ran straight into the bedroom. Justin clenched his fists angrily. He had been getting along well with his son today, yet now, he had actually made his son cry because of that woman. At this point, Lawrence came over and said excitedly, Mr. Hunt, we've received news that Auntie is coming to the hospital in town for an operation. Observers are allowed during the operation. I've asked for a spot, and I plan to send someone there to stand guard. We'll catch hold of her this time for sure. Justin thought for a while. then looked at the bedroom. At last, he said, I will go in person. The next day, Nora didn't go to the operating room after entering the hospital. She went to the ward to visit her aunt first, intending to comfort her. As soon as she entered, a worried Lisa came over. Nora, is the message you sent me yesterday saying that Mom will undergo surgery today true? Nora nodded. Yeah. Next to them, Angela sneered. You're such an unlearned piece of trash. Nora, do you know that Aunt Irene's tumor is located in a very risky area? It's impossible for ordinary surgeons to operate on her. Nora looked at her. I know that. Since you do, then why did you still look for someone to operate on her? You're obviously taking her life lightly. Angela looked at Will and Lisa and said, I've already shown Dr. Larson Aunt Irene's CT scan a long time ago, and even he is hesitant to take on the task. Do you really think she can get a better doctor than Dr. Larson? When Will heard this, he asked somewhat hesitantly, Tell me the truth, Nora, how high is the operation's success rate? Before Nora could even reply, Angela scoffed and said, I'll tell you the truth, there are only 2 doctors in the States that can achieve a success rate of 50% in this operation. Apart from them, everyone else can only achieve 10%. If you don't undergo the operation, Aunt Irene can still live for another 2 months. But if you do, there's a 90% chance that she won't be able to come out of the operating room alive today. Her words frightened Lisa so badly that blood drained from her face. Isn't there a better doctor? Oh, there is, Angela said. There's Dr. Anti, the top surgeon in the world. To her, there is no surgery that cannot be done. She can achieve a 100% success rate. Unfortunately, Dr. Anti is currently abroad and a great distance away from here. Even so, many of the wealthy and powerful can't find her. So how can ordinary people like you possibly convince her to do it? The ward was dead silent. Just as Angela was all smug and both Will and Lisa had lost all hope, the 3 suddenly heard Nora's low voice. In that case, do you know who the doctor I got is? Angela said sarcastically. Did you not understand what I was saying? Unless it's Dr. Anti, the situation won't change. No matter who you've gotten over, scaring a patient before their operation, and making them nervous and full of distrust toward their doctor held 0 benefits for the operation. Nora had come over intending to comfort her aunt right from the start. At the sight of their pale faces, she was just about to utter the name Anti when Irene suddenly said, I trust you, Nora, let's get ready for the operation. Nora paused. Angela said sharply, What a fool. Are you also in a hurry to die? Lisa became even more nervous. Mom. Irene gave her a wry smile and said, How many doctors have your father and you approached for this operation? No one dares to do it because none of them wants to be held responsible. It's hard no matter who does it anyway, so why bother so much about who the operating surgeon is? She would take the risk, and see if God also thinks that this should be the end of her life. She looked at Lisa and Will and said, Remember this, Will, Lisa, no matter whether the operation succeeds or not. This is what I've chosen. It has nothing to do with Nora. Nora lowered her gaze. Her heart warmed. The door to the ward opened and a nurse came in. Mrs. Black, we'll be transferring you to the operating room now. Outside the operating room, after waiting for Irene to be transferred into the operating room, Nora decided to head off to make pre-operation preparations. However, the moment she turned, she heard Angela's voice. Where are you going, Nora? I get it now. You must be having a guilty conscience, so you're too scared to face what's going to happen, right? You're afraid that the Blacks will blame you for Aunt Irene's death when the hospital staff brings her dead body out later. You can't go. You have to stay here and take responsibility for Aunt Irene's life. Nora paused and slowly said, I have something on. Angela scoffed and said, What do you have that's more important than Aunt Irene's life? Why are you so cold-blooded? Will, who was listening to the conversation between the two, clenched his fists. His eyes were filled with fierce disappointment. No matter whether the operation succeeded or not, he wasn't going to cast any blame on Nora, but as his wife's most beloved niece, couldn't she even stay with her during the surgery? At this time, a nurse came up and said, Can I get her family members to sign the medical liability waiver form, please? Will's hand trembled at the sight of the surgical consent form and the liability waiver form she handed over. With her eyes red, Lisa's voice trembled as she asked, What does this mean? Angela stepped forward, her face still sporting a relaxed and happy smile. Obviously, she wasn't concerned at all about the life of the person in the operating room. She said sarcastically, It means that the doctor won't have to take any responsibility even if he causes the death of the patient during the surgery. Aunt Irene's surgery is such a difficult one. The doctors aren't fools. They'll definitely ask for liability waiver form to be signed. Lisa's face turned pale with fright. Angela was extremely satisfied. Her eyes swiveled a little and she grabbed the consent form from the nurse. Then, she looked at the section naming the chief surgeon at the bottom as she said, "I want to see who this surgeon is. So brave to actually undertake Aunt Irene's operation." The operation was bound to fail. But that surgeon had agreed to operate on her aunt, thereby potentially ruining her grand plans to usurp the company. She wanted them ruined. There was a sinister look in Angela's eyes, but when she saw who the chief surgeon was the next moment, she suddenly froze. How could this be? Anti? Beside her, Lisa exclaimed, "Is this the top surgeon in the world that you guys were talking about just now?" "What?" Will also exclaimed. "Let me take a look." As the two of them stared at the chief surgeon's name, their eyes started to light up again. Will looked at Nora in surprise and asked, "Nora, how did you manage to get Dr. Anti to do the operation?" Nora cast her eyes down and randomly made up a story. She said, "Anti likes challenging operations. So I tried emailing them Aunt Irene's CT scans. I didn't expect them to agree." Will's eyes turned red. "I've misunderstood you. Nora, it's okay," Nora said dispassionately, "but I really do have something up. So I'm going off first." The shocked Angela was still frozen in place even after she left, and she watched Lisa and Will sign the forms. Will even cried because of how ecstatic he was, and she felt as if she had been made to eat her words. "Hurry up, Dr. Anti has already arrived." Several doctors from the hospital strode into the operating room. They were representatives that the dean had carefully selected to observe Anti's operation. This was a rare opportunity for them. Dr. Larson, the head of the Department of Neurology, happened to be among them. When he was about to enter the operating room, he suddenly caught a glimpse of Angela and he stopped immediately. He called out, "Angela, is that you?" Angela came back to her senses and greeted him. "Dr. Larson." Dr. Larson was Angela's professor at the School of Medicine in college. He asked, "Why are you here?" Angela hurriedly answered, "My aunt's the patient." Dr. Larson's eyes lit up right away and he beckoned to her. The two went over to the side and he asked, "What's your family's relationship with Anti?" Angela replied, "My aunt is in serious condition, so the operation's a challenging one. Practically none of the doctors in the States are capable of performing it. So I tried emailing Anti. Unexpectedly, she really agreed to take on the operation. Can you bring me in to observe the surgery, too?" A scheming look filled her eyes. It was that damned fatty who had sent the email. But how would Anti know who the sender was anyway? It is undoubtedly an honor to be able to observe Anti's surgery. Enlightened, Dr. Larson said, "So, you're the one that got Anti over. You've made a huge contribution to the hospital. Of course, I can bring you in." Angela hurriedly followed after Dr. Larson. Among those here to observe, apart from the well-known specialists in the hospital, there were only a few promising doctoral students. She was the only undergraduate there. If she became a well-known doctor, then Anthony definitely wouldn't find her beneath him anymore. Nora slipped into the operating room through the side door. As soon as she entered, she spotted Lily, her surgical assistant. She had flown into the States overnight in order to help out today. In order to keep their identities secret, the two of them were the only ones in the dressing room. Lily put on the surgical gown for her. After completing the disinfection procedures, they entered a room in the second hallway. There, they ran into the doctors present to observe the operation. They had changed relatively quickly and were currently crowding around Angela and chatting. "To think you actually managed to get Anti over. Angela, I heard from Dr. Larson just now that he intends to get the hospital and college to focus on training you. Wow, that's so awesome. You'll definitely become a well-known surgeon in only a few years. What an honor it is for undergraduates to observe Anti's surgery." Angela, who was surrounded by them, felt as if she was on cloud nine. At the sight of Anti, she hurriedly walked up to her and said, "Hello, Dr. Anti, I'm the one that sent you that email. Thank you for operating on my aunt. I really look up to you. Can you give me a chance to become a postgraduate student under you?" Nora was bewildered. Nora had a mask, goggles, and surgical cap on, so she was totally covered from head to toe. No one could see what she looked like at all. Therefore, none of them saw the mocking smile at the corners of her lips. She really didn't expect her younger sister to be this shameless. Had it been before, she might have considered being a little nicer, but now, Nora suddenly smiled and said, "Oh, so you're Nora Smith." She had deliberately lowered her voice, which made her voice, which was already deep, sound even deeper, as if she had a sore throat. As soon as she said that, the whole operating room suddenly fell silent. Everyone, including Dr. Larson, looked at Angela. Angela's smile froze, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Did that damned fatty actually sign off the email? Dr. Larson's expression turned sullen and he asked, "What's the meaning of this, Angela?" Angela braced herself and started to make up a story. She said, "I'm sorry, Professor Anti, Dr. Larson. I was afraid that Professor Anti would reject my request, so I was too embarrassed to use my real name and ended up using my sister's." Dr. Larson's expression mellowed. "I see. Gee, all of her sister's ingenuity had been put into use here instead." Nora cast her eyes down. As she walked to the operating room, she asked seemingly curiously, "How did you get hold of my email address?" Angela, who had just heaved a sigh of relief, was bewildered. Why would anyone ask about this? Besides, her aunt was the patient. Her claim that she had sent the email made logical sense, so there was no need to press the issue at all. She wiped off the perspiration that had formed on her forehead again and stammered, I asked a friend for it." Nora continued her questions as if nothing had happened. She asked, "Can you tell me what my email address is?" Angela abruptly stood still, the exposed parts of her face already pale. Her reaction was too telling. A red-faced Dr. Larson reprimanded, "What's the matter with you, Angela? Were you the one who sent the email or not?" Angela could only tell the truth. And no, it wasn't me. Having reached the doors to the operating room, Nora opened them. Before entering, she heard Dr. Larson shouting angrily behind her, "To think you could bring yourself to say something like that in order to observe the operation. A student of poor character and upbringing like you is not worthy of observing Anti's operation. Get out." In the operating room, Irene clenched her fists nervously as she laid on the cold bed and stared at the ceiling. She turned her head toward the door when she heard it opening. When her gentle eyes met the doctor's, she swallowed nervously. She knew that she would probably die on the operating table today. A 10% success rate was too low. Just as a wry smile appeared on her lips, the doctor suddenly came over. In a low voice, she said, "I'm Aunt Irene. Go ahead and sleep. When you wake up, you'll be all fine." Irene's eyes widened suddenly. Past the goggles, a pair of familiar cat-like eyes entered her sight. On the top floor of Hotel Finest, Daddy's a bad man who misunderstood Mommy. "I'm not talking to you." In the bedroom, Cherry hugged the one and only plush toy in the pile of toys and turned her back to the door as she sat in the corner. The big and tall Justin stood at the door. The little fellow had such a bad temper. She had been ignoring him since the day before, and she kept staring at him accusingly with her big and teary eyes, making it seem as if he had done some terribly heinous things. Lawrence was in the room trying to coax her. He said, "Don't sit here anymore, Pete. Why don't we go over to where the toys are?" Cherry raised her head and curled her lip as she said, "There are only cars and airplanes there. It's no fun. Why aren't there any Barbie dolls?" Justin's jaw tightened. He looked at the family doctor and asked in a low voice, "Is the test ready?" "Yes, it is." After answering, the family doctor walked into the bedroom cheerfully and said in a cajoling voice, "Why don't we do a little test? Pete, I'll give you a Barbie doll when we're done." Cherry, who was completely unaware that this would put her brother in a rather unfortunate situation, immediately nodded. "Okay." Seeing his son happily following the doctor and walking out of the bedroom, worry appeared on Justin's countenance. The test was over very quickly. A short half an hour later, Cherry bounced out of the study with the Barbie doll that the family doctor had rewarded her with and ran past Justin into the bedroom without looking anywhere else. While looking at her from the back, Justin, who had an indescribable expression on his face, entered the study and asked, "Are the results out?" The family doctor coughed and replied, "Yes, it is. Please be mentally prepared, Mr. Hunt." Justin clenched his fists tightly. The family doctor said tactfully, "It is obvious that Pete pays more attention to men than women. The test has shown that he thinks he's a little princess." Bam! Justin slammed his fist on the desk. He, who had always faced all the dirty deception and trickery in the commercial world with skill and ease, actually found himself feeling a little helpless. What was he to do about this? The sound startled the family doctor. It was only when he looked back and saw Lawrence beckoning him at the door that he finally walked out of the room. After waiting for another half an hour, Lawrence said, "It's time, Mr. Hunt." He had already asked around. Anti's operation would take 7 hours. The timing would be just nice if they went over now. Justin stood up solemnly. let's go. He glanced at his son when he was leaving the room, combing her doll's hair. He hummed a little song as he nimbly braided the doll's hair. Then, he picked a set of clothes and started to change the doll into it. He tried, again and again, to keep his temper under control. At last, he said, "Daddy's going out for a while, Pete. Let's play with the airplanes together when I'm back." Cherry ignored him. Justin then said, "I'll buy you a Barbie when I come back in the evening." Cherry's eyes brightened and she looked at him eagerly. However, she forced herself to look away. She said, Cherry Pete doesn't want a Barbie doll. I want mommy." Sob. She had already changed places with Pete for 2 days. She missed mommy. What the heck was Cherry Pete? Justin, who felt as if his heart had been pierced by a million arrows, left the hotel broken-hearted together with Lawrence and headed to the hospital in town. In order to ensure that he could catch Anti, Justin decided to enter the operating room. While he was changing, next to him, Lawrence said, "This is a psychological issue, Mr. Hunt. How about we ask Miss Smith to come over and talk to Pete?" Justin cast his eyes down. The thought of Nora irritated him even more. When he came in to change, he had noticed that her aunt was still in the middle of her operation, yet she was nowhere in sight. A woman like that. He rejected the suggestion again. "No, it isn't necessary." Even if his son wasn't normal, at least he wasn't a heartless and callous person. After leaving him a cold reply, he pushed the door open and entered the operating room. Inside the operating room, all the lights were focused on the operating table. His eyes locked directly onto the woman who was currently performing the operation with full concentration. Upon seeing her, a slightly stunned expression came over his countenance. Justin had seen a photo of Anti before, but the woman who was performing the surgery, she seemed much thinner than the one in the photo. He stood quietly behind the crowd. No one was allowed to enter the operating room in the middle of the operation. If it weren't for the fact that this hospital belonged to the Hunts, it would also have been very difficult for him to enter. Therefore, Justin abided by the rules very much and didn't go forward immediately. He intended to wait until Anti had finished the operation before he approached her. The operating room was very quiet. Only a woman's professional but hoarse voice sounded from time to time. "What's her heart rate? Her blood pressure? Number 10 blade. Hemostatic forceps." She had likely already been operating on the patient for 6.5 hours. The assistant behind her was constantly wiping the perspiration off her brow. But even now, her hands were still very stable and didn't show any traces of trembling at all. Her eyes, as she stared intently at the operating table, were focused and serious. Although one couldn't see her face, she nevertheless exuded an indescribable charm. Justin initially thought that he had arrived too early, and felt rather irked that he had to wait here for 20 minutes. But as he watched her perform the dry and boring surgery, before he knew it, the time had actually already gone by. This continued until she finally said, "Close the wound." The assistant who had been behind her all this time replied, "Okay." The chief surgeon was the one who performed the operation while the assistant did the simple stitching at the end. Everything had gone smoothly in the operation so far, but at this point, it seemed like someone had accidentally bumped the tray that an assistant was holding, and the scalpel on it suddenly fell onto the ground. The scene instantly became a little chaotic. The lights around the operating table were very bright, which caused the sides to look a little dark in comparison. Anti was hidden right among the assistants moving about. Anti, who was among them, reprimanded, "Why were you so careless? It's fortunate that the final stitches are the only thing left. You guys, go and clean up with me." "Okay." The assistants, together with Anti, were all wearing surgical gowns of the same color. They headed straight to the sterile area. Justin quickly followed after them. After entering the sterile area, they took off their goggles, masks, and gloves, and washed their hands with running water. Except for one, the rest were all blonde. Anti wasn't blonde. Thus, Justin walked straight behind the only person who wasn't blonde there, clapped his hand over her shoulder, and said, "Hello, Anti, I've heard a lot about you." However, the woman that turned around was a plain Jane. She looked at Justin in surprise and said, "Dr. Anti has already left. I'm Lily, her assistant." "You are." Justin frowned. It was then that he realized that he had been fooled. Did Anti really think she could get away today? Though, he took a step back, picked up his cell phone, and called Lawrence. He ordered coldly, "Lock down all of the operating room's exits and check all the personnel inside." "Yes, sir." In the operating room, from the corner of her eye, Nora could see Justin going out of the ward. She let out a huge sigh of relief as she stood in front of the operating table. She had already known before she came as Anti to perform the operation that the news would definitely get out and attract the attention of that man with high social status. Therefore, she had already made preparations for it beforehand. It was common knowledge that the chief surgeon didn't do trivial things like sutures. However, Nora demanded perfection when operating on her aunt, so she would definitely do it herself. To everyone else, Anti had already left with the assistants. Who would have thought that she had merely turned around amidst the chaos earlier and was actually still here? She moved quickly. Within a mere 10 minutes, the stitching was completed. Finally, after checking her aunt's various data indicators, she announced, "Operation successful." The duty of postoperative care was given to a professional nurse. She and the 2 remaining assistants then followed the observing doctors to the sterile area. Nora yawned sleepily. The toll that a 7-hour operation took on one was unimaginable. To people who naturally had a weak constitution like her, it was very punishing. She would probably have to sleep for 14 to 15 hours straight when she gets back later. She was just thinking about that when she suddenly noticed Lily, who was in the sterile area, giving her a look. Nora paused. A foreboding feeling suddenly arose in her. The next moment, she saw a row of bodyguards in black standing at the operating room entrance and checking everyone's identities one by one. Lily demanded angrily, "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Hunt? We were invited to perform an operation. Why should we undergo your unreasonable cross-examination?" Justin stood guard at the door with an unwelcoming presence, his tall figure exuding a strong sense of oppression. Next to him, an expressionless Lawrence replied, "My apologies, miss. You're not doctors employed by this hospital after all. Should any accidents happen to the patient, I'm afraid we'll have to take responsibility. Therefore, please leave behind your contact information." Nora cast her eyes downward slightly and sighed inwardly. That tyrant is really hard to get rid of. How about fighting her way out? However, her sore fingers and weak legs were telling her that she currently didn't have enough strength to do that. She didn't notice that Justin had been staring at her, even though she was wearing a surgical gown. Her figure was very similar to Anti's. Everyone in front was cooperating with Lawrence's investigation, but she was the only one standing at the back and looking a little like she had a guilty conscience. Justin strode over to her, his thin lips parted slightly, and he said, "That was a really good trick. You almost had me there." Everyone looked over, making Nora the focus of the sterile zone. Justin said solemnly, "Dr. Anti, why don't you take off your mask?" The man was tall, and there was an intimidating and oppressive air around him when he stood in front of one. Nora suddenly let out a low chuckle. Then, she reached up and took off her mask and goggles. The goggles hooked onto her surgical cap, causing her dark hair to also cascade along with the action. Justin's eyes widened at the sight of her familiar and exquisite visage. How could it possibly be her? Nora lowered her eyes like she always did and said in a low and lazy voice, "Since you've caught me, I have nothing to say." Justin's heart skipped a beat. Then, he heard her continue and say, "I am indeed in the wrong for sneaking into the operating room to watch over my aunt. If the hospital wants to hold me accountable, I'll take it." Then, she looked up and said frostily, "However, as a family member of the patient, I should think that the hospital can understand why I did that." Her voice was cool and clear like the clink of glasses, which gave off a sense of steadiness. The first thought that came to Justin's mind was actually so. She didn't ignore her aunt. Nora observed the man in front of her. The look in his eyes was unfathomable, and his eyes were deep and dark. Even the mole at his eye exuded an unpredictable and mysterious air. She didn't know whether he believed her or not. While she was thinking, the man suddenly said, "If Miss Smith agrees to a condition of mine, then on behalf of the hospital, I can promise not to hold you accountable." "What is it?" Justin let out a low cough and said, "Come back to the hotel with me and play with my son for 2 hours." Pete had been angry with him since the night before and had ignored him even all the way until he went out, and kept asking for mommy. Now that he knew that she wasn't such a cold-hearted and unfeeling person, his son would definitely cheer up if he brought her back. Right, Nora was bewildered. If her memory was serving her right, the first time they met, he had warned her to stay away from his son when they were at the movies the day before. He had also given her another warning. Was the man suddenly out of his mind? Seeing her surprised, a somewhat uncomfortable look came over Justin's face. In order to get close to him, that woman had done everything possible to get Pete's approval, therefore, she would never miss this opportunity. He was just thinking about it when he saw Nora casting her eyes downward coolly. "You must be mistaken, Mr. Hunt. I'm not a childcare teacher, neither do I have any fantasies about you." Justin paused. Nora took a step forward, with a momentum that didn't lose out to his in any way. She said, "Also, if the hospital really wants to hold me accountable, please contact my lawyer." After saying that, she covered her mouth, yawned, leisurely walked past Justin, and left the operating room. She was already on the verge of falling asleep. How would she possibly have the time to play with a kid? The most important thing now was to hurry back home and sleep. Even Justin didn't have the right to detain people at will. If he couldn't find Anti, then the only thing he could do was release them. In the car back to the hotel, Lawrence complained, "Can Anti be an eel? Why is she so slippery? How did she get out when I was obviously standing guard outside?" Justin, who was in the back seat, replied, "There are 3 possible explanations. 1, our intel was wrong and Anti is blonde. 2, Anti has very good moves and managed to escape, but this is unlikely. Yes, we surrounded the area very securely, unless the hospital has an underground tunnel or she can fly. There's no way she can get out." Then, Lawrence asked, "What's the 3rd possibility?" Justin kept quiet, then, he turned and looked outside the car and slowly said, "Nora Smith is Anti." The corners of Lawrence's lips spasmed a little. "Compared to that, I'd rather believe the second one. We've already thoroughly investigated Miss Smith. Someone who has never even gone to school can't possibly be Anti." Speaking of her, though, it turned out that she was the one that emailed Anti. That was why Anti had come. No wonder she was always so calm whenever her aunt's surgery was mentioned. As it turned out, it was because she had total confidence. Justin pressed his lips together tightly and frowned. Then, he suddenly said, "Find someplace where we can buy a Barbie." In the stairwell on the top floor of Hotel Finest, the 2 children had sneakily met up. An aggrieved Cherry whined, "I haven't played any games for 2 days. Pete, Daddy is too strict. He doesn't let me use the cell phone." Pete replied, "Let's switch back for now." Cherry nodded. Yes, 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 let's switch again after I've played my games for a day." "Yeah," Cherry sighed. "Daddy really hates Mommy." "Pete, what should we do?" Pete frowned. After pondering for a while, he said, "If the soft approach doesn't work, then let's try the hard approach." Cherry's eyes lit up. "What kind of hard approach?" The 2 little ones put their heads together and discussed for a long time before they finally reluctantly separated. Before leaving, Cherry blinked and said triumphantly, "By the way, the doctor made me do an IQ test today. My IQ is really high. The doctor rewarded me with a prize." And even Daddy was speechless with astonishment. Mommy had also let her do something similar before, and even praised her and called her a genius. She had made her brother proud today. Pete, who believed her again, praised her. "You're so awesome." He returned to the room. He was just about to enter the study and spend some time doing some revision when he heard the door open. Justin strode in. He took off his coat. Then, he walked over and said, "Don't be mad anymore, Pete. Take a look at the toy that Daddy bought you." Pete's eyes lit up. The tyrant was always urging him to study every day and rarely let him play. He had actually bought him toys today. Then, he saw Justin walk over with a big pink Barbie and place it on his desk. A question mark slowly appeared in Pete's mind again. Seeing that his son didn't react, Justin thought he was still mad and asked gently, "Shall Daddy play with you?" Pete stared at him with an indescribable expression. Seeing that he was finally reacting, Justin braced himself and suggested, "Let's style Barbie's hair and change her." He opened the Barbie's box packaging and took out the doll. However, after picking up a lock of hair, his fingers, which were extremely nimble and flexible while playing the piano, froze. With a constipated look, Justin looked at his son and asked, "Do you know how to tie a braid, Pete?" Pete was speechless. After the 2 stared at each other for a long time, Pete finally slowly uttered, "This is so stupid." Justin's face instantly darkened. For some reason, his son's calm and unflappable expression made him unable to control his anger. "I'm doing this all for you." Pete lowered his head and flipped open the book. Completely ignoring him, Justin was shocked. Then, he stared at the question that his son was looking at. The question was beyond Pete's current syllabus, so he asked, "Can you understand such a difficult question when you don't even have a strong understanding of your basics?" Pete raised his head and glanced at him again. Which part of this simple question was difficult? The tyrant's behavior was simply a mystery today. He said coolly, "Don't disturb me when I'm studying." Justin felt very speechless when he saw how his son was acting as if he totally understood the question when he clearly couldn't solve it. And he said, Fine, do what you want. He would see for himself how long Pete could carry on the pretense for. After dinner, a perplexed Justin sat in the study. His son had obviously been behaving very adorably, so why did he suddenly become reserved and taciturn again? Although he seemed more normal now, for some inexplicable reason, Justin instead missed the way he had wheedled and how animated and quick-witted he had been previously. He picked up his cell phone and called the family doctor straight away. He asked, "Why is Pete's personality switching back and forth?" The doctor thought for a while and replied, maybe something had triggered him previously, causing his personality to change. A trigger? What could have possibly triggered him? Could it be that woman? Downstairs, Nora took a bath and fell into a deep sleep immediately after she came back. With her cell phone in her hand, Cherry sat on the sofa and played games with Chester. Chester was as talkative as ever while they played. He said, "Did you get into an argument with Justin again? That behavior doesn't work on him. Why don't you wheedle instead? Also, Justin didn't manage to find Dr. Anti today, so he's in a bad mood. Aren't you just asking for it by doing that? He was looking for Dr. Anti?" Cherry was stunned. She glanced at the bed in the bedroom and asked, "Chesty, why is Daddy looking for Anti?" Chester replied, "Isn't it obvious? It's for you." Before he finished, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Lewis was busy in the kitchen, so Cherry jumped off the sofa and walked over to the door. She didn't think much and opened the door right away. Justin was currently outside the door. He wanted to try asking Nora again to go upstairs to take care of his son. He got ready to speak when the door opened, only to spot Cherry right away.